Welcome back, everybody, to the course of world history. I am Mr. Samuelson, and today it's the plague, the Black Death, the Bubonic Plague. Let's talk about it. What was the Black Death, and what was its impact? Well, let's start with plague. All right, the Black Death is a specific breakout of the plague. Let's talk about the plague in general. The plague is caused by a bacteria, sneaky little thing called Yersinia Pestis, which is carried in fleas. Now, the plague can be transmitted to people, or really any mammal, in three different forms. There's the most common, the bubonic plague, which is plague of your lymph nodes. That's the system in your body that helps keep you healthy. It kind of turns it against you. There's a septicemic, maybe. This is plague of the blood vessels, and then there's pneumonic, which is plague of the lungs. Now, these are all easily transmitted through the air. They can be transmitted through direct contact, and they can also be transmitted through undercooked foods. So it can get into you in a number of ways. Now, as I said, the Black Death is not the only plague out there. Let's talk a little bit about the history of plagues in the West. The earliest historic reference to the plague was in Greece during the Peloponnesian Wars, so way, way, way back in ancient history. But this plague shows up in Athens, and the city of Athens loses a third of its population. 33% fatality rate. That's a pretty significant plague. The plague then pops up again in Rome in 166 AD. 7 to 10% of the Roman Empire's population was killed during this time. So it was a much bigger spread, smaller fatality rate, but still a much larger number of overall deaths because of the population of the empire as a whole at that time. It's estimated somewhere between 3.5 and 5 million people died in this outbreak of the plague. Then it hits again. The plague of Justinian hits the Byzantine Empire in 541 CE. Now, this one was believed to have begun in Asia, but it didn't hit the Asian empires as hard as it hit the Europeans. Once it got to this dense population center of Constantinople, this plague just exploded. And at its peak, Constantinople was estimating about 10,000 people per day were dying in this city. It does not take long at that rate to depopulate a major capital. During this plague, Europe's population, which was pretty depressed. I mean, this was the Dark Ages in Europe. There weren't that many people around because of the collapse of civilization and all that. But it is estimated that the fatality rate of this one in Europe was as high as 50%. Again, lower populations in Europe, Constantinople gets hit really hard, but still devastating. And about as many as 100 million people died worldwide during this outbreak of the plague. Which brings us to the Black Death. This is specifically used to refer to a plague that strikes Europe, although it was a worldwide plague, but it hits Europe between 1346 and 1353 CE. Now, it most likely originated in East or Central Asia, somewhere, China or Mongolia, somewhere out in the East. And it will lead to the death of about 200 million people worldwide. Now, this Black Death spreads after first being reported in China in 1331. So the first reports were in these densely populated Chinese cities. It takes 15 years for the plague to work its way along the Silk Road routes and hit Constantinople. This plague then will devastate Europe as it had also devastated China. So the individual spread, how does this pesky Yersinia pestis spread around? Well, the bacteria lives in the stomach of fleas. Now, fleas survive, they're bloodsuckers, right? They bite something and they drink the blood. And when they do that, they regurgitate a little bit of that blood back. And the bacteria that's in their stomach then gets right back into whatever they are biting, spreads through that bite. Now, these fleas themselves, they didn't survive on people. People try to keep themselves clean. Sometimes people have fleas, but mostly we try to clean ourselves off and don't have too many fleas. But rats wind up being the host of these plague fleas. And many of the rats will die. Right? They get the plague and they die. They're susceptible to it. But some develop enough resistance to bring those fleas with them and to travel from the east to the west. And then people will get the plague when they are bit by the fleas. Now, people didn't know about the fleas for a while. They thought the rats themselves were carrying the plague. But it was, in fact, the fleas. And then the bacteria would get into the people and could spread from person to person. So what are the symptoms? The most common form of plague is bubonic plague, which was plague of the lymph nodes. It enters the body through the skin, usually as a result of this flea bite. And then you get swollen lymph nodes, particularly in the groin, in the armpits, and the neck. And then those swollen lymph nodes will turn black as they start to die. About 2/3 of people who got bubonic plague did die of this form of the disease. But this was the one that you wanted if you had to have plague. Because the others, pneumonic plague, the plague of the lungs, was transferred from person to person when infected droplets were inhaled. So somebody coughs and you breathe in that cough and you can get it. And this one is almost 100% fatal. Once you have the plague in your lungs, it kills you. The septicemic plague, the plague of the blood, was transferred mostly by these flea bites. It was the rarest form. It didn't appear too much, but like the pneumonic plague, it was about 100% fatal. These two forms, you don't want them. Go back to the bubonic. Okay, if you have to have plague, this was the one to have. So the Black Death, it shows up in Europe in 1347, and it shows up in a particularly nasty way. An invading Mongol army was facing the city of Kaffa. Kaffa was resisting them, and the Mongols decided they were going to destroy the city for this resistance. They decided to destroy it by catapulting the bodies of plague-infected victims into the city. Lovely Mongols. The Genoese, Italian folks, who were in the city, decide to get out of that city when the plague starts to spread, but they, of course, bring it with them. And the fleeing Genoese enter into Italy, into Genoa and Venice, and the plague begins to spread. From Italy, the plague then spreads to other port cities and along other trade routes and just takes Europe by storm. Mortality rate of this, most victims showed symptoms within 2 to 5 days and died within 2 to 7 days of the symptoms appearing. So it was a fast-acting plague. The disease kills its victims 4 to 12 days after it's contracted. Now, in 4 years, the Black Death killed about 45 to 50% of Europe's population, in a period where the population was much higher than during the plague of Justinian. It takes about 150 years for Europe's population to recover from this. They don't get back up to that rate until we're then in the 1500s. All right, hardest hit areas. The worst hit areas were cities, where large numbers of people lived in a small area. They could spread the disease very easily. Some fled to cities, these cities to country manors. They got out of the city, but then they just brought the plague with them and got everybody in the feudal manors sick as well. The plague then strikes the cities and manors along trade routes harder than others because that's where you're going to see the disease spreading most frequently. Now, some people did have a natural resistance to this. As mentioned before, not everybody dies. These people sometimes helped to transmit the disease, though. They could have it and just not, be dying of it, and still transmit it to others. Now, if somebody was lucky enough to survive the plague, their resistance to future waves of the plague does increase. The more times you have the plague and survive, the better your body gets at fighting it. But this is not something that you can be immune to. Immunity does not exist. You can't be immune to a bacterial infection. And Yersinia Pestis is a bacteria. So it can still kill you. All right, that's all for the plague. I hope it didn't gross you out too much. And I'll see you next time. Farewell.